In December 1927, 2 days before Christmas, London's West End became a battlefield. But there were no guns, no explosions, no men with masks. Instead, women dressed like film stars in furs and expensive jewellery descended on department stores from Gamage's in Holborn through Oxford Street's Selfridges to Whiteley's in Paddington. They moved like a swarm of locusts, one detective said, hitting multiple stores simultaneously in a coordinated operation that left shop assistants helpless and security overwhelmed. These were the 40 Elephants, Britain's longest-running and most successful criminal organization, an all-female gang that operated for over 80 years from the 1870s to the 1950s. They weren't desperate women stealing bread to feed starving children. They were professional criminals who stole goods worth thousands of pounds, lived extravagant lifestyles in Soho nightclubs, and built a criminal empire that forced other thieves to pay tribute or face brutal consequences. Their queens ruled with absolute authority. Their members wore specially designed clothing with hidden pockets for stolen goods, and their reputation was so fearsome that male gangsters in the Elephant and Castle mob admired their organization and expertise. Welcome to Clyde Crooks, where forgotten gang wars and underworld histories get dragged back into the light. If you want more stories of real gangs, real blood, and real consequences, subscribe and ring the bell. New episodes drop 4 times a week. The 40 Elephants operated from Elephant and Castle in Lambeth, South London, one of the poorest and most notorious slums in Victorian Britain. An 1899 survey by social reformer Charles Booth highlighted clusters of slum housing around the Elephant and Castle Tavern, classifying inhabitants as the lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal. Families lived together in cramped, decaying, terraced houses with poor sanitation. Rents were high, employment was low. For women especially, legitimate work meant domestic service, factory labor, or prostitution, all brutal, all barely paying survival wages. Some looked to criminal activity as a way out of the living conditions they were born into. The gang took their name from either their base in Elephant and Castle or from the way they looked after stealing, waddling out of stores like elephants with goods crammed into hidden pockets in their clothing. They were allied with the Elephant and Castle mob, led by the MacDonald brothers, a long-running male criminal organization that operated from the Elephant and Castle Tavern. The female gang members were often the partners or relatives of male gang members. But while the men controlled protection rackets and street violence, the women specialized in shoplifting, called hoisting in the criminal underworld. The earliest mention of the gang dates to 1873, though police records indicate female shoplifters had been active in the area since the late 18th century. There are mentions of young women connected to a male gang named the 40 Thieves as early as 1828, with members aged 10 to 20 who carried tattooed marks on their hands made with Indian ink to recognize each other. Whether this was a predecessor to the later 40 Elephants is unknown. What is certain is that by 1876, an all-female gang under the name 40 Thieves was operating in South London. The first identifiable leader was Mary Carr, born in Holborn in 1862. Carr became involved with the gang sometime in the 1870s and steadily advanced through the hierarchy to become a prominent member and eventually earn leadership and the nickname Queen of the 40 Thieves. Around 1890, Carr was elected leader and refined the mechanics of their signature heist, turning a loosely organized group of petty thieves into a well-oiled criminal machine. She enforced discipline and turned her home at 118 Stamford Street into the gang's first base of operations. The street had such a bad reputation, it was called one of the ugliest and sordid streets in London. Carr married fellow criminal Thomas Crane in 1888 and used multiple aliases including Polly Carr, Eva Jackson, Anne Leslie, and Jenny Leslie. Under Carr's leadership, the gang perfected their department store theft skills, terrorizing high-end West End shops, including Harrods and Liberty, with large-scale shoplifting sprees. Carr was particularly known as a jewel thief in West End hotels. Her charismatic leadership style made her so famous during her life that she was claimed to be the model for famous paintings, such as The Maid with the Yellow Hair by Frederick Leighton. It was also suggested that Carr was inspiration for The Worst Woman in London, a play by Walter Melville. A police report from 1900 described her as one of the most dangerous women in the metropolis. Shopping had transformed into middle-class leisure in the late 1800s. By the early 1900s, London had over 100 department stores. These stores were seen as respectable spaces for women of all social classes, which meant the 40 elephants could blend in better than male criminals. Shop stock had begun to be more visibly displayed on tables and hangers, making it easier than ever to steal. The gang divided themselves into cells, with each cell allocated a patch of the city where they operated before police noticed their movements. The women wore specially modified clothing, with hidden pockets, cummerbunds, muffs, skirts, bloomers, and hats designed to conceal stolen goods. This hiding of things in clothing was called to clout or clouting. They dressed to kill, one detective recalled, descending on West End stores like a swarm of locusts. Due to modest attitudes of the era, female customers were afforded privacy from store staff, giving female shoplifters opportunity to escape notice. Even when caught, middle-class-looking women often did not suffer prosecution because shop assistants hesitated to accuse what appeared to be respectable, wealthy customers of theft. Some gang members would distract shop assistants while others stole. In one case, a 40 caused a scene by stuffing a cushion under her skirt, pretending to be pregnant, and then collapsing on the shop floor. Another method was approaching well-to-do-looking men on the street, pretending to ask for directions. While the man showed the way, other gang members would appear and accuse him of assault. Rather than make a scene, the man would give them money or valuables. If he threatened to call police, they would steal his pocket watch or other items close at hand. The gang stole goods worth thousands of pounds. Female gang members earned enough money to financially support their husbands, who included both idle men who lounged at home and habitual offenders. The women didn't wear most stolen items. Instead, they sold everything to a network of fencers, street market traders, and pawnbrokers. Part of stolen clothing was sold to clothing stores, which simply replaced labels and modified designs. The gang received commission payments from fences. They spent their money on high fashion and fun. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the gang gathered in London entertainment venues like music halls. After World War I ended in 1918, they could be found among the elite of Soho's blossoming nightclub scene at venues like the Golden Calf or 43 Club. They lived hard and fast in a revolving door of heists, prison sentences, and lavish spending. The gang was particularly territorial. Other shoplifters who stole from shops on their turf were forced to pay the gang a percentage of their takings. If intruders refused to pay, the gang arranged beatings and kidnappings until payment was received. While various gang members were arrested and convicted, their prison sentences tended to be short, either 12 months of penal labor or 3 years incarceration. Once released, they returned to the gang. Several members remained with the gang for decades. A gang member named Ada Wellman was initially arrested in 1921 and was still with the gang when arrested again in 1939. Carr's reign saw heightened scrutiny. Sensational trials took place when the gang was implicated in the 1895 abduction of traveler child Michael McGee and a vicious gang attack on female rival Nellie Stanley that same year. Carr was later romantically involved with the leader of the Elephant and Castle gang, Alf Gorman. Contemporary headlines reported that after Carr's trial and prison sentence for child abduction, fellow gang member Minnie Duggan succeeded her. But Carr was released 3 years later, suggesting Duggan just temporarily filled the leadership role. Both Duggan and Carr were incarcerated in 1905. Helen Sheen, nicknamed Fair Helen, then had a brief stint as leader from 1905 to 1906. Sheen was arrested and sentenced to 2 years after drugging and stealing from a man. Carr, having been released from her last prison sentence, moved to Manchester where she died in 1924. From 1915, the gang was led by Alice Diamond, known variously as Queen of the 40 Thieves, Diamond Annie, and friend of Maggie Hill and Dolly Mays, sisters of gangster Billy Hill. Diamond was born in Lambeth Workhouse Infirmary in 1896 and grew up in poverty with precarious housing. She started stealing as a teen. The Elephant Boys marked her out for leadership. Aged 20, Diamond became queen. She was strong, smart, skillful, and didn't shy away from a fight. Suitably enthroned, Diamond acted the part. She wore big fur coats, big hair, and big makeup. She also wore a series of diamond rings. Diamond's criminal career began in 1912 when she was cautioned along with Mary Austin, who would later marry North London racing gangster Frederick Sabini for stealing chocolate. Convictions for theft followed, and in 1915 she was named by police and newspapers as Queen of the 40 Thieves, successor to Mary Carr. Diamond had taken over leadership of a large and expert gang of organized shoplifters. She was a skillful organizer of large expeditions across the West End of London and spread her enterprise to the provinces when London became hot. Her chief lieutenant was volatile and violent Maggie Hill, born Margaret Lily Hill, into a criminal North London family that would one day produce Billy Hill, dubbed boss of Britain's underworld. One police detective in 1920 called Diamond and Maggie Hughes the cleverest shoplifters in the country, and their associates regarded them as the most expert thieves in the world. Their heyday was in the interwar period, when the gang raided on a large scale not only in the West End of London, but also other major shopping centres across the country. The gang eventually became well known to high-class shops they typically targeted. Their mere presence could cause alarm, eliminating the secrecy required for their activities. Their response was to expand from London to other British towns where they were less known. They targeted rural areas and seaside towns. During the 20th century, the gang modernized. They invested in fast cars to transport loot and use as getaway vehicles which could outrun police. Loot was also transferred through the British railway system. Members used trains to travel to a town and deposited empty suitcases at railway stations. During their return trip, suitcases were filled with stolen goods. Besides shoplifting, the gang developed sidelines, such as looting houses and blackmailing individuals. Gang members used false reference letters to get hired as maids and then robbed the houses of their employers. They also seduced men into brief affairs and then blackmailed them with threats of ruining their reputations. They also forced smaller gangs to pay tribute on what they had stolen and would punish criminals who did not obey their rules. The gang had its own set of rules and demanded loyalty from its members and others in their supply and distribution network. Alice Diamond ruled with absolute authority, with the cooperation of Maggie Hill, Gertrude Scully, the Partridge Sisters, and many others. Over 70 direct members of the gang operating in the 1920s and 1930s have been identified. They were said to be able to meet numbers of men in street fights, though preferring to stick to their specialty of sneak thieving. They were admired by their male counterparts in the Elephant Gang for their organization and expertise. One member of the gang, Lillian Goldstein, was known to police as the bobbed-haired bandit, the lover of Elephant Gang associate Ruby Sparks, and was useful as a driver on his smash and grab raids. The gang was also associated with Frankie Fraser, whose sister Eva Fraser was a member of the 40 Elephants. Diamond could also use violence to defend herself and was feared by her community. Maggie Hughes once stabbed a police officer in the eye with a hat pin and blinded him. Diamond was arrested for violent conduct in 1925. The Daily Express wrote that Diamond used to have information brought to her from all parts of London. Daily bulletins of places and people earmarked for plunder, and it was she who directed the entire operations of the gang. Nothing was done unless the Queen gave the order. Despite their skill in evading authorities, the 40 Elephants would still get caught. But the time spent at court or in prison was seemingly a risk worth taking. Many members, including ringleaders like Diamond and Hughes, were imprisoned at Holloway in Islington. Holloway had been converted from a mixed prison to a women's prison in 1903. In the early 1900s, shoplifters served sentences here, at the same time as many suffragettes imprisoned in their fight for women's vote. Diamond would retire from leadership in the 1930s, and the role was taken over by Maggie Hill. Hill was arrested in 1939 for blinding a policeman with a hatpin and sentenced to 4 years in Holloway Prison. On her release, Hill retired from shoplifting. Hill was succeeded by Shirley Pitts. Pitts had been taught to shoplift under the tutelage of Diamond and other gang members in the 1940s. Pitts was given the name Queen of the Shoplifters by newspapers. She was an acquaintance of Ronnie Knight, the Cray brothers, and Charlie Wilson. Pitts later remembered, "By going out with the 40 thieves, I saw a different way of life. I had visited the West End before, of course, but I had never been to Harrods or the posh hotels they took me to." Pitts would lead the gang until her death in 1992. Reports that the gang collapsed when leaders were jailed for the 1925 Battle of Lambeth are incorrect. The gang was still in existence after World War II, as new family members replaced old hands. At least 70 women were part of the 40s across generations. They were aunts, cousins, mothers, or sisters. It was a family affair, a way of life passed down through generations. Being part of the 40 Elephants was part of their identity. They took pride in the skill and teamwork required. The story of the 40 Elephants matters because it shows that women weren't just victims or accessories in Britain's criminal underworld. They were organizers, leaders, and professionals who built a criminal empire that lasted over 80 years. They operated in a world that offered women almost no legitimate paths to wealth or power, and they carved out their own through intelligence, skill, and ruthlessness. Their queens weren't elected through votes or inheritance. Leadership fell naturally to the most trustworthy leader that others wanted to follow. The 40 Elephants are gone, their specially designed theft clothing now museum pieces, their queens dead, their headquarters at 118 Stamford Street long demolished. But their legacy survives in every story that challenges the assumption that organized crime was always a male domain. Different era, different methods, same fundamental truth. When society offers people no legitimate path forward, some will create their own. And gender is no barrier to ruthlessness when survival is at stake. This is just one chapter in Britain's hidden underworld history. If you want more stories like this, from medieval outlaw armies to Glasgow's razor gangs, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which gang story you want next. This is Clyde Crooks. See you in the next war.